In the previous video, we covered 25 of the edible plants, trees, nuts and berries that you can easily find out in nature. Here's 15 more to add to your collection of knowledge. Wild garlic. If you're walking through the woodlands and you are met by a white carpet of flowers, then you may have stumbled across wild garlic. Colloquially known as ramsons, these are a botanical relative of the familiar cultivated garlic. Though it is not the root that we're after with this wild variety, it is the leaves themselves. The leaves taste like garlic, so would make a fine addition to whatever you're cooking up over the campfire. The tasty leaves of wild garlic are large, long, narrow, lance-shaped leaves that are smooth and featureless with the exception of its central mid-rib. The leaves are edible raw, though the plant is best identified by its clustered flower head, with each individual flower having 6 narrow-pointed petals, white anthers, and 3 green ovaries in the centre of the flower. The entirety of the plant is edible. The flowers, the leaves, the stems, and also the roots, which are comparatively tasteless, but are a good source of calories and carbohydrates if you can wash the mud off them. And being as wild garlic often grows in huge patches, their edible roots may be the solution to your post-apocalyptic hunger. Though outside of starvation or famine, leave the roots in the ground and let it grow back next year. Sounds good. There is, however, a look-alike, known as lily of the valley, which is poisonous. This plant has almost identical looking leaves, smooth, lance-shaped, and featureless, with white flowers, though lily of the valley's flowers are bell-shaped and crenulated, so it is hard to mistake the two plants when you identify based on the flowers. It would be a mistake to pick wild garlic before it has flowered, as you may unknowingly be picking lily of the valley. Both wild garlic and lily of the valley can grow amongst each other, as seen here. So it is important to make sure that the leaves you are picking are originating from the stem that hosts the 6-petaled clustered flower heads. Wild garlic is one of the most popular foraged foods, owing to its ease of identification, visibility, and abundance. So it's a good one to learn to recognize. It's top of the list, a high-value plant. Wood sorrel, a woodland delicacy. If you're walking through the woods and you see a patch of white, pink, or yellow, then it's worth having a closer look, as there's a good chance that it's edible wood sorrel, a plant that has a pleasantly sour, citrusy, lemony taste that is sharp and sweet, like the skins of apples, which makes it one of the more interesting and pleasant taste profiles that you can find out here. And what makes this plant so easy to identify are its leaves. Clusters of 3 heart-shaped leaves, somewhat resembling the shamrocks of the clover plant, which too is edible, by the way, both pink and white varieties. The 3 heart-shaped leaves are what separate it from lookalikes, of which there are a few. White-flowered wood sorrel can resemble the extremely similar-looking wood anemone, which too is a ground-dwelling white woodland flower, but has 6 to 7 petals rather than wood sorrel's 5, and also does not have 3 heart-shaped looking leaves. These leaves are the key feature when identifying wood sorrel. Yellow-flowered wood sorrel can resemble lesser celandine, and aside from petal variation, lesser celandine does not have 3 heart-shaped leaves. These leaves are the key feature to identifying wood sorrel, and whether they are pink, white, or yellow, the wood sorrels will have 5 petals. However, the unique and refreshing sour taste of wood sorrel does have a downside. You cannot eat them in unlimitedly large quantities. The oxalic acid content of wood sorrel makes it a plant you would nibble a handful of, but no more, as oxalic acid can deplete the body of calcium and other nutrients, and increase the likelihood of kidney stones if you are particularly prone to them, which may not be the most immediate concern if the alternative is starvation, but still worth mentioning. It is best to graze upon them lightly. Though there are plenty of other common foods that are notably high in oxalic acid, such as spinach or almonds, and they seldom come with similar warnings. So, oxalic acid content is not something unique to wood sorrel, nor is it something that doesn't already exist in our diet to some extent. But you are advised to eat them in moderation. A handful of the woodland sour candy here and there is fine, just maybe don't eat the entire patch. Mulberry. Simply put, they resemble elongated blackberries. But what makes mulberry so easy to identify is that they grow on trees rather than on bushy, thorny shrubs like blackberries. So they're likely to be found above your head rather than down by your ankles and knees. There are several varieties of mulberry, some ripen at black, some at red, some even ripen at white. And unappealing those may look, all varieties are equally as edible straight off the tree. They all taste sweet. Another identifying feature of the mulberry tree is that the leaves are broad with a serrated edge. Different varieties of mulberry will have different shaped leaves. They can either be teardrop shaped, notched on one side only, or they can be divided, lobed leaves. But one feature that they all share is a serrated edge. Hazelnuts, otherwise known as cob nuts, are the edible nuts of the hazel tree. While on the tree the nut is white, and their most salient feature is a leafy sheath that can either be partially covering or entirely covering the nut, like a turtle-necked collar of lettuce leaves. That's the hazelnut. Easy protein. The white you see is not actually the nut itself, but is the immature, unpigmented outer shell. Those must be cracked open to reveal the nut within. Do not be tempted to break through the shell with your teeth. That's how you end up in a dentist chair. Grab rock, smash with rock, as you would with walnuts, and that's easy life. If left on the tree to mature, they will eventually fall, and the outer shell will ripen into their more recognizable brown hue. The leaves of the tree are broad, have a crinkled texture, are serrated along their edge, and terminates to a point at the tip of the leaf. Many trees such as birch and alder produce catkins, long hanging, drooping flowers that produce and disperse pollen. These typically occur in the spring, with the catkins of both birch and alder being edible. The hazel tree also produces edible catkins, but they develop in the winter rather than the spring. They don't taste great, all catkins are quite bitter, but they are a source of calories and protein at a time of year that is otherwise quite a scarce and barren environment. Think of them as Mother Nature's bitter gummy worms. Gooseberry, a member of the currant family, and one of the larger edible berries you may find, averaging 1 to 2 centimeters in diameter, similar to the size of a grape. They come in two varieties, those that ripen at green and those that ripen at red. Both taste like a slightly more sour, acidic grape, but still sweet enough though. What makes either variety of gooseberry unique and identifiable are their striations, those lighter shade of lines running down the length of the berry. Think of a berry that aspires to become a basketball, and that's the gooseberry. Some varieties of gooseberry will have little spines on the berry themselves, which can be irritating if you were to swallow them. These are typically eaten by scoring the skin of the berry with a knife and then squeezing the berry's interior into your mouth, then discarding of the spiky skin. Sharp thorns are present upon the branches, which makes gooseberry a prickly thing to forage, but is rewarding as it's one of the sweeter tasting berries that you'll find out in nature. The leaves of gooseberry are also distinct. They are divided, lobed leaves, as if an oak leaf and a maple leaf had a baby. Ribwort plantain. If there's grass, there's probably ribwort plantain growing in amongst it. Towering over the grass, sitting atop of a slender, wiry stem that is a green to brown, bullet-shaped flower head that often has tiny white seeds seemingly in orbit around it. At the base of the plant, there is a rosette of long, slender, lance-shaped leaves with prominent ribs running down their length. All parts of the plant are edible, though the stems are unpalatably wiry and the leaves become more bitter as they age. But the flower heads taste like mushrooms, and the white seeds that orbit it do have a calorie and protein content. And being as the plant is widespread and widely abundant, you can leave a field with a solid handful of seeds. Think of spending 15 minutes plucking a field's worth of plantain seeds as spending 15 minutes gathering yourself up a scoop of whey protein powder, and you can see the value of this plant. As the flower head dries and turns brown, they also become a good source of dietary fibre. A popular dietary fibre supplement known as psyllium husk comes from the dried flower heads of a botanical sibling of ribwort plantain, Plantago ovata, otherwise known as blonde plantain. Greater plantain, otherwise known as poor man's spinach, it is a botanical relative of ribwort plantain, also belonging to the genus of Plantago. It features a ground-dwelling rosette of broad, spoon-shaped, crinkly leaves, and a tall, green to brown, spike flower head. This plant grows everywhere ribwort plantain grows. You won't have to look far. And being a hardy plant, it can even be found growing in arid, sandy environments, gravel tracks, and pavement cracks, so you cannot escape it. It is all around you. And it is a plant that almost sounds too good to be true, though it is certainly not because of its taste profile, which is on the bitter end of the spectrum, but its nutrition profile. 100 grams of this plant contains the same amount of calcium as 100 grams of milk, and almost as much vitamin C as 100 grams of oranges, which almost sounds too good to be true, but that is what the studies suggest. For reference, 100 grams of plant matter is a bowlful, 100 grams of milk is half a glass, and 100 grams of an orange is 2/3 of an orange, approximately, which is not bad for a plant that grows in the wild that you've probably been spending your whole life unknowingly trampling underfoot. So in terms of meeting nutritional requirements out in the wild, greater plantain is the plant to look for. Every field will have greater plantain in it somewhere, and if the studies are to be believed, then greater plantain could be considered a wild superfood, if you can stomach the bitterness. Think of it as a health food akin to spirulina or the not so great tasting kale, and you will have the correct understanding. Sweet chestnut. There are two varieties of chestnut. Sweet chestnut, which are edible straight off the tree, and horse chestnut, more colloquially known as conkers, which are poisonous. The nuts themselves look identical, but their husk is what tells them apart. Sweet chestnuts have every millimetre of their husk surface completely covered in overlapping spikes and needles, like a curled up hedgehog, whereas the spikes of horse chestnut are shorter and far fewer in number. Sweet chestnut husks break open into segments of 4, revealing their edible nut. The brown is its outer shell, and if the nuts are still fresh, that outer shell will be soft enough that it can be peeled away with just your nail and fingers, revealing the cream-coloured edible nut within. The spikes on the husk are not soft or superficial. They are indeed hard and sharp. So the way to open out the spiky husk is to step on them with your boot or smash them with a rock, and then use a nail to peel off the outer skin of the nut. The traditional way to eat them is to roast them over the campfire, dehusking them and then roasting them while still in their thin brown shell. Roasting in camping contexts is sticking them in an empty mug and heating them over the campfire. But sweet chestnuts can also be eaten raw and unroasted. A solid source of protein, as long as you do not mistake them for their toxic sibling. In their raw state, they are higher in tannic acid, which some people might be more sensitive to than others. So if you're going to eat them in large quantities, you will probably be better off boiling or roasting the nuts beforehand to reduce the tannic acid content. This not only makes them less bitter, but will also reduce the chances of upsetting your stomach. The two trees can also be told apart by their leaves and flowers. The flowers of the poisonous horse chestnut are an upright, ice cream-shaped cluster of flowers, the technical term being panicle. The flowers of sweet chestnut are more of a thin, narrow pipe cleaner. The leaves of horse chestnut are palmate, compound leaves composed of 5 individual leaflets originating from a single point on the stem, whereas the leaves of sweet chestnut are pinnate, multiple leaflets coming from different points along the stem axis. Heather. If you're up in the hills or grasslands, then it won't be long until the hillsides erupt into carpets of pink and purple. This is likely heather. They have pink bell bulb or vase-shaped flowers with a long, protruding pink stigma and thin, feather-like leaves, which are a key identifying feature. The morphology of the plant is that of a spike, tall, narrow tendrils that are covered in flowers more or less top to bottom, and both the flowers and the leaves of heather are edible, with subtle undertones of spice and apple, with a sweet scent. Heather has many lookalikes. It is commonly mistaken for various varieties of heath, which are different plants belonging to separate genera but do look very similar. One way to tell them apart though is heather has feathers and heath has teeth. The foliage of the heath plant are needles, similar to those of coniferous spruce trees. Another feature of certain species of heath is that there will be a dark red to black protrusion beyond the petals before the stigma. True heather does not have this feature. Heather is not exclusively a upland grassland plant. It can also be found in the woodlands or amongst the grasslands bordering on the woodlands. So it's a good one to know. Gorse. Where you find heather, you will also likely find the bright yellow petalled gorse growing either in amongst, next to, or in the area. Gorse has an oddly shaped flower that defies any attempt to label them, though when fully open I recognise them as a sailing ship, a Viking longship, but their key feature is the narrow, needle-like leaves that run down the entire length of the stem, resembling a coniferous tree such as spruce or fir. These needled, spruce-like leaves allows them to not be confused with vetch, which too has oddly shaped yellow flowers that elude description, but lack the hard, spiky, spruce-like needles on their stem. Another feature of gorse is that they smell like coconuts and taste like almonds, and it is their fragrance and their taste that makes them a fine choice for wild teas. Perhaps you can make yourself a variation of moorland tea, which is the petals of gorse and the flowers and leaves of heather steeped in hot water. That's how you do it. Moorland tea. Wild cherry. A fruit that you're just as likely to find around the neighbourhood as you are in the wild. Easy to spot in the spring, as they are one of the first trees to erupt into a white, sometimes pink, blossom. Wild cherries are smaller than store-bought, cultivated varieties of cherry, and they ripen at a bright blood red. They are edible straight off the tree, but it is a bit of a coin flip as to whether they'll be sweet or slightly sour. There is a hard stone in the centre that you will break your teeth upon if you're not careful. And of course, don't swallow the stone either, as it is slightly poisonous. Chew around it and spit it out. Easy life. Wild cherry trees can also be identified by their bark. They have a distinct, shiny, greyish-brown, silvery bark that is covered in horizontal scars, similar to birch trees. The technical term for those horizontal scar-like features are lenticels. Their foliage, ovate-shaped, serrated leaves, and a common feature of cherry species are the presence of two red glands, or nectaries, at the base of the leaf, where it joins to the stalk. This can aid in identification. The flower blossoms of wild cherry are also edible, tasting a little like almonds. Beech nuts. Another tree that produces an edible nut is the beech tree. The husk of the nut resembles the sweet chestnut, a green to brown ball of wiry spikes, but smaller. Once the husk opens out, it will break open into segments of 4 and somewhat resemble a flower. The nuts inside are also segmented. Each segment a flat, deflated-looking nut. It is not a plump, round nut like sweet chestnut or hazel. Beech trees are quite recognisable even from a distance, as their bark is remarkably smooth and grey. It makes me think of an elephant's skin and an elephant's leg when the base of the tree is flared, which it very often is. You can always tell a beech by its bark. Bark that looks like taut elephant skin, that's a beech tree. And unfortunately for the beech tree, because of this characteristic smooth bark, they are the tree most likely to be engraved upon. The glossy leaves of the tree have a wavy, crinkled edge with a pointed tip, with the veins of the leaf being straight diagonal, unbranching, and slightly asymmetric, similar to hazel leaves, but glossier. These nuts, however, should not be eaten raw in large quantities. A modest palmful is fine, but in any larger quantity than that, beech nuts should be roasted first. And roasting, in the context of wild camping at least, is sticking them in an empty metal cup and placing it over the campfire. The heat destroys the saponin glycosides that can cause upset stomachs if consumed in large quantities. But roast them first, and you can eat as many as you like. Barberry. There are many red berries out there, some edible, some poisonous. One red berry that's quite easy to identify by shape alone is the barberry. The berries are an elongated, oblong shape, and this shape distinguishes them from the multitude of red berries out there, most of which being spherical. There are many varieties of barberry. Common barberry grows in large hanging grape-like clusters with anywhere from 10 to 30 berries per bunch. Other varieties, such as the Japanese barberry, are less numerous, either being singular or in small clusters of 2 to 4, and are covered in sharp thorns. That too is an identifying feature, so mind your fingers. The ripe red berries of barberry are safe to eat straight off the tree. They do not taste great, they are tart, sour and acidic. They are to be considered more of an emergency survival food rather than a delicacy. Their foliage, oval-shaped, or to be more precise, the technical term is obovate, that turns a deep red to purple in the autumn, with a smooth, unserrated edge. The presence of flowers is also an identifying feature, hanging drooping clusters of cup-shaped yellow flowers. Another berry that could be mistaken for the barberry are rose hips, which too are oval and egg-shaped, but are more bulbous than they are oblong, with sharply pointed, serrated leaves, rather than the blunt, smoothed-edged leaves of the barberry. Rose hips are edible too, by the way, but they must first be split open and have the inside scraped out of their irritating fuzzy hairs and seeds. Barberries can also resemble the toxic flowering dogwood, which too has oval-shaped berries that are longer than they are wide. However, these grow in very tightly packed, omnidirectional clusters, as opposed to barberry, which has lots of space between each individual berry and grows in a droop, with each berry, more or less, hanging in the same direction. Another elongated berry that you may find in the wild is honeyberry. There are many berries out there that have a dusty pale blue tinge to them, most being inedible, most being spherical. But the honeyberry is edible straight off the tree. These grow from green stems and smooth-edged, slightly furry leaves, and are not to be confused with the slightly toxic wintergreen barberry, which too is pale blue and oblong, but grows from purple, reddish stems and has spiky edged leaves. I do appreciate that it can be confusing. Wood avens, a plant that you can find growing anywhere. The woodlands, hedgerows, by the roadside, and perhaps even as a weed in your own garden. Otherwise known as herb bennet or herb benedict, it is a small yellow flower with yellow anthers, sitting atop often knee-height, wiry stems. 5 yellow petals, spaced well apart. Between them, a green, 5-pointed set of star-shaped sepals, a key feature that helps to distinguish it from other yellow flowers. Eventually, the flowers die and become a seed head, a recognizable ball of Velcro-like burrs which often cling to clothes and canine companions. The hooked seed head starts off green but matures red to brown. The foliage, leaves that are bluntly serrated and have a slightly fuzzy, furry texture. The entirety of the plant is edible, including the roots, which is the main selling point. Wiry, noodle-like roots, which have the distinct smell of cloves, a sweet, spicy scent, that once washed and cleaned, they are a good source of carbs and calories, that is grown, sold commercially and eaten in various parts of the world. And being as wood avens spreads quite quickly, you can usually find it in widespread abundance. Salsify. In amongst the meadows and long grass, you may find a flower that looks like a larger, taller dandelion. This is meadow salsify. Yellow flower head, black anthers, with each individual petal being notched on their tips. But the key feature are the long, narrow, blade-like sepals that protrude far beyond the petals themselves. You may often find meadow salsify with its flower head closed, even during the day. They open out in the morning, but close up again after midday, which has earned them the common name of Jack go to bed at noon. Later in the year, they will turn to seed, a large fluffy globe, also resembling the dandelion. Meadow salsify is edible in its entirety. The flowers, the leaves, the stem, and the root. And it is the root which is the most prized edible feature. A long, vertical taproot that resembles a parsnip or pale carrot once you've cleaned the mud off. This edible root is grown, cultivated, sold commercially and eaten in many parts of the world. There are also pink varieties of salsify which, aside from colour, are identical in their morphologies. Those long, narrow, protruding sepals behind the petals are the main feature to look for when identifying salsify. And that's all for now. If you're new to the channel, then be sure to watch the previous video, 25 Wild Edibles, which covers even more of the edible plants, trees, nuts and berries that you'll likely find on your trips into nature. Stay safe out there, and peace!